you doing? Oh, that's not very loud. Hold on one second. Yeah, that should be the right mic. So, oh, maybe I'll turn it up a little bit. That should be a bit better. Hey, everyone. How are you doing? Yeah, let me just quick adjust this for a quick second. All right, I've been away for a while, so hopefully that is not too bad, and hopefully you can all hear me just fine. Welcome back to Social Science Sunday. I have been on holiday for a long time, and then I was ill. So it is good that to see you again. It is good to see you again, and I'm out of practice. Clearly out of practice. But I want to say hello to DN Fan in the chat, and also to EZ7. Good to see you both. And we're going to be working today on, we're going to be looking today at applying some of the philosophical concepts that we talked about in prior lectures. Yeah, I'll just call them lectures. I am out of the habit of talking. Can you see? I'm not flusish. I'm not at all like fluid with my speaking at all today. So I'll have to work on that. But in prior lectures, we discussed the philosophical perspective of like what exists, how does it exist, how can it interact with other things causally. And then what you tend to do in these kinds of research design courses oftentimes is you'll go through a whole bunch of different methodologies. And by methods, well, one methodology usually and several different methods. By methods here, I mean a particular way of collecting data. So in a quant course, we would have the philosophy, the epistemology, and then we'd start going through descriptive statistics and go through the various ways that you can look at data to describe what's in the data set. And then we'd look at inferential statistics and go through a whole bunch of ways that you can test theoretical predictions by using statistical methods to test for a null hypothesis of no effect. And then you come to the research design part, usually at the end of the course. The idea behind this is you give people the philosophy, you give them a range of tools to look at, and then you teach them how to pick the right tool. But in some ways I feel like you don't really know what always is the right tool to pick, or what your options are if you don't know research design at the front. So I want to go over research design earlier in this not officially course, because I think understanding the logic of how researchers think and the tactics that they employ to try to get to an answer it can be opaque. It can be difficult for people to understand why a particular method was selected or why a particular approach was taken, because it seems like it was defaulted from the start. So I want to look a bit first. Also, to be fair, this is relevant for my research. My co-author and I, Adzia Carvalho, are currently trying to finish up an article by the end of this year that examines whether or not you can replicate qualitative research. And you'll see one of the ideas here in the lecture notes I'll go through quickly, but one of the things that we're going to be arguing in the paper is by drawing on some other researchers who said that the purpose in quantitative social science is to find universal law-like causal relationships that you can gather data for empirically and then test with statistical methods to produce the same coefficients at the end of the process, or at least very similar in direction, strength, and size. So you might have some variation because the sample is now census, it's still only it's a sample, but generally outside of a margin of error of maybe 5%, you're quite confident that this relationship you're describing with your numbers is real. How does qual do that? And we can't do it the way that quants people do it, because we don't have a source of data oftentimes, because it's language-based, not numbers-based, that would allow us to have a null hypothesis of no effect. The important thing to know about a null hypothesis of no effect, so the null hypothesis is you're wrong. Your theory is just wrong, and we know your theory is wrong because the coefficients on your regression are 0. It has no effect. Doesn't move it up, doesn't move it down. Or it's within a margin of error where 0 is included. So maybe it's 0.05 to -0.5. 0 is one of those numbers, so that would mean no effect is a possibility, so you can't reject the null hypothesis. That's the logic of all of the maths that they do in the quants world, is to try to get enough evidence, not to try to get, but to test whether or not there is sufficient evidence that the coefficient can be statistically significant from 0. In qual, we can't do that. We have language, we have ideas, we have text, and so how can we demonstrate generalizability? How can we say that what is happening in our qual data, we have a basis to think that there is an actual theory, a theoretical relationship between our phenomenon that we should test quantitatively, that we should test empirically? Because remember, qual is an investigatory tool. It's not a confirmation tool. It's not a testing method. And the answer that we are taking in this article, I'm still talking about my article, is we're quoting some people who said analytic, the category here is a numerical generalization, but analytic and logical generalization. Is it the case that a reasonable person, because we don't have a cutoff point, we don't have a null hypothesis in qual, but that a reasonable person looking at the same evidence would come to the same conclusion that repeated, hi pasta, that if you repeated this study again and again and again, you would get similar concepts, similar categories, or similar explanations, which is a very loaded term and I'm hesitant to use it, but let's say accounts, similar accounts of relationships between different concepts or categories. So that, and what we're going to say, I'll just give you a preview, in our article is that in the 10 years or so that we have collected data on British political leaders, that the categories, regardless of who the leader is, what party, whether the person likes them or not, there are 3 core political leadership categories that repeatedly emerge. The first one is competence. And the other thing that we can link to that is that the candidate, hi Flint, the candidate that, whether or not the voters like them, scores highest on competence, ends up being the prime minister. So, and then there's another category, which is trust. How trustworthy are they? Generally, politicians do not score high on trustworthiness, but some people are seen as more trustworthy when they speak, when they communicate than others. And then the last one is kind of like so it's competence, trust, and kind of like a personality or a leadership, just kind of generally what the vibe is that that person has. And we see these categories emerge from the data in every election for every leader, and we've watched it happen for almost a decade now. So we feel very confident that when it comes to understanding British political leaders, the political leadership metrics should be grounded in these 3 concepts. Now they generally are, but they're not grounded in those concepts. They're grounded in a couple other concepts as well, to be fair. Likability, like how much do you like them? I don't know what that means, I guess warmth, right? But these concepts are what voters say that they're looking at, and we don't have a theoretical grounding for leadership qualities. So we would say, look, qual can provide this fit, and we think we can generalize from our little focus groups to the entire country, because every time we ask people these questions for the last 10 years across the country, we keep getting the same answers. And this analytical stubbornness or analytical category stubbornness, persistence, stickiness, longevity, gives us confidence that what we're seeing is not just a mirage, that we're not just picking on something epiphenomenal in a particular election in a particular context. Right. Can those scores enter negative numbers? On the quants one, so Flint is asking, can scores of likability, I'm assuming that you're saying like on leadership metrics, can the scores enter negative numbers? So the way that a scale works is when we use it in regression, any one step down would be considered a negative move, right? So we're moving either in a positive or a negative direction relative to the thing we're trying to explain. As a consequence, it doesn't really matter what scale you use. And from what I've seen from the comparative study of electoral systems, most countries tend to use like a 0 to 10 scale. an 11-point scale. And actually they've sort of, in the comparative study of electoral systems, I think they've asked people to like homogenize the scale. So you don't have an 11-point scale and a 10-point scale, and a 9-point scale and a 7-point scale. And then some studies, like the German longitudinal election study, will take that 10-point scale and they'll take everyone's score and subtract 5 from it, so that technically the scale runs from +5 to -5, with 0 being the median category. But that's metric-wise, that's identical as it being from 0 to 10, because a one-step is a one-step is a one-step. And so when people are asked on a scale of 1 to 10 to evaluate how much they like a leader, if their score is lower, it will be reflected in the maths as a negative number. It'll be as a down step, right? But the scales themselves generally don't have negative numbers, because from our point of view, it doesn't matter if you code something 10 or 5 or 0 or -5. Mathematically, it's treated the same way in a regression analysis, which is a one-step, which is a 10-point scale or an 11-point scale. So that's like a really, like, yeah, I hope that answers your question, Flint. Yeah, it's a super nerdy question, and I love it, because that's the kinds of things that, you know, one thing you'll see, I'll just go on, I'll go on a little side tangent here. Oftentimes, in data analysis, we will waste a lot of time recoding things to a common scale. So for instance, a 0 to 10 scale, or a 1 to 5 scale goes to 0 to 4 or something like that, because some people like to have every single metric, if possible, start at 0, so that when you run the regression, the A constant value that you get is actually 0 for everything. And maybe I'm getting too complicated here, but by having a base of 0, you always know like what one step up would mean for each coefficient, because they're relative to each other. You know what? I think I will stop, because we're not on that level of quants yet. So glad you liked it, Flint. Hello, Paul and Sib. So Paul asks, would the idea of heterogeneity and homogeneity fit into the data here? So what Paul means by heterogeneity and homogeneity is that for the purposes of sampling in quantitative approach, homogeneity means being similar, and heterogeneity means being quite different. So let's say if you went to and you got 10 packets of Mentos, which are all the same flavor, then it doesn't really, you can put all those Mentos, 10 Mentos, into a jar, 10 packets of Mentos. And because of the homogeneity of the sample, if you picked out one, you have a perfect representation of what everyone else thinks. All right, so on an extreme, like this, we'll say this sample is, you only need a sample or an N of 1, because every single thing is identical. That would be like unrealistic homogeneity with human beings. On the other side, let's say you have a mix of like Skittles, right? And you take 10 packets of Skittles and you dump them into a bowl. And you pick out one, the chances of your one color being able to represent what is in that bowl is very, very low, because there's a far more heterogeneity in the color scheme. There's far more difference and variation in your sample that could ever be represented by pulling out, or in your population, I should say, in your population of Skittles that your sample of 1 could get. That means statistically that for a population that is more different, you need a bigger sample size. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it does mean, one, you need a random sample so that you don't introduce any bias, ideally, and you need to speak with a margin of error, because it's not going to be a perfect representation. So let's say instead of grabbing 1, you on average grab 20 Skittles, and then you start to count and try to figure out the distribution of color in your population jar, for instance. So heterogeneity and homogeneity is a question of sampling quality for quantitative social scientists. Sampling is still an issue for qualitative, but in very different ways. And that's because in qualitative research, we are not driven, what you're doing, actually, it's a good opportunity for me to go into this. So the question here is, I'm going to give you the short answer because I might forget, Paul. and that is, in qualitative research, we sample on the theoretical question. So we don't sample to be representative of population, we sample to try to capture the people who are theoretically relevant, because we're trying to establish a descriptive account of what is happening, trying to capture that information. So we would, because we sample on the theoretical criteria, if we do, presumably, if we do a good job of sampling on the relevant criteria, then the population we sample will be relevant to our question. They'll have homogeneity in terms of possessing the qualities that we're interested in theoretically relative to the rest of the population. But our aim isn't to be a small snapshot of the population, because we're not to that testing phase yet. So the question is, do the people that we recruit, do they have theoretically relevant information or perspective to give? That makes sense. So and that's where we get to grounded theory, where our metric for have we collected enough data isn't a representative sample size, but is our research and investigation coming up with anything new? So research design, let me just be a little bit clear in my language here. When I'm talking about research design, either for qualitative or quantitative research, the research design, I mean the entire process from start to finish, from the first idea to figuring out the right literature, to developing, doing research, great research on how to get your research funded, to developing a study, to recruitment, to data collection, data preparation. That's your research design. How am I going to do every step of the way? When I say a study design, what I mean, or I should mean, is the specifics of how those data are collected. So within a research design, let's say on media analysis, you might have a study design that includes analyzing headlines. That's where your content is, and you're going to code those headlines as positive or negative, and then do some sort of linguistic analysis, content analysis, we call it discourse analysis, on the meaning, tone, emotions of the words in those headlines. So a study design would be a focus group, it could be an ethnography, it could be a particular method, right? A method, not a methodology. A methodology is like a quantitative methodology. It's a whole approach, but a method is a particular tool. So you can think about your methodology as like a toolbox, and then your methods are your various tools inside that toolbox that help you find the right data. Another thing about qualitative research design is because we're not testing it, we don't follow the scientific method approach of data, of research processing, because our aims are different. And unlike quants isn't a straightforward linear process. It does tend to follow a certain order. You ask a question, you do this, the other thing. In qualitative research, it's exploratory. And that means that you don't know necessarily what you're looking for. As a researcher, you need to be open to finding data in a pattern, or data that clusters, or data that someone writes a phrase or comes up with a phrase that captures a way of thinking about a topic that is new to you or original. And that means it's iterative. It means you develop an initial idea, you do research, literature, make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel. Then you go into the field, you collect the data, you analyze the data from, let's say, like 5 interviews or 2 focus groups. And if you're doing, really new exploratory analysis, I don't have to do this now because I've done so many election studies qualitatively that I know what's going to happen in a focus group. I generally know how it's going to go. I've got theoretical grounded theory saturation levels up to here when it comes to various concepts. It's just about how it's going to be described in this election. But an initial foray out there, you would want to then go through and do an open coding of your data. Just let the data speak to you and cluster what you're finding into general categories, or pull out concepts that seem to be emerging, or look at the relationships between 2 phenomena that people are linking, and how they're putting them together, and why they're putting them together. And then you refine your ideas. You check them back against the literature, kind of think back, like, what am I seeing in the literature versus what I'm seeing here? And then you refine your ideas a bit and you go back to the field. and then you do it again, and you go back in the field, and you do it again. And that's the difference between quants and qual. Is quants, you have a one shot. You run your model once on this particular data set and you're done. But with qual, because you're exploring new conceptual areas, and you are learning the limits and the angles and the dimensions of the concepts that you're discovering or uncovering, then that requires you to have a lot more flexibility and also be very data-led. You're not theoretically out there testing something that's predefined. You are coming up with a definition. And so you go back into your field, you collect more data, and you analyze that data, that second run of data. You keep, ideally, usually you run out of money or time beforehand, but ideally your goal is that when you go out into the data and you ask similar questions, or you talk to similar people about the same topic, that you're not hearing anything new. Like, I've heard this before, I've heard that concept before, I've heard that category before, and when you can pretty much predict, like all the things that are going to get said in a room before you even start it, because you've run 15 focus groups before. I'm just speaking from experience. You've run 15 focus groups in the last 3 weeks, and you're at theoretical saturation. You reached it already, but you have to collect the data. You're still collecting the data, right? You organize it, you paid for it, but you really want to follow through with your research design. And then at that point, you can start writing up your conclusions, your descriptions, what you're finding. So for instance, getting back to that leadership analysis, our plan currently is to release as a data set all of the brainstorming phrases, words, and other things that came to mind when people looked at various political leaders and say, hey, replicate our data. Like when we looked at this and we looked at the language, these kinds of things were emerging and they connect. And these connected things all kind of, what links them together is their evaluations of trust. So this is why we put these words in the trust category. But someone else, could come and look at them differently. So putting out your data and analyzing it, there was a point I was going to make, but I can't quite remember what it is now. We're going to put it out there, and this is it, is just to say that if you look at the literature on leadership, just generally in psychology, in management, in political leadership, in other kinds of leader metrics, it's a really mushy category. It's a very ill-defined, vague category, and part of that is because what is required, we would speculate, the reason for that is what is required for leadership really isn't consistent across different fields. Like the skills that a politician needs to have to be considered successful as a leader will depend on the personality of the person, how they come across. It also depends on the field and what they're doing and what the situation is at the time. So what we would say is that the measures that we have that are atheoretical, measure it, but we don't know why. And our contribution here provides some insight into why do these measures work from a qualitative perspective and from why people's own evaluations, not a top-down imposition of categories from political scientists to vote. Right, so anyway, by the way, I want to say who else I saw in the chat today. I think I missed someone. Besides Pasta, I said hi to Pasta, right? Okay, good. This I mostly said, right? Qualitative research is inductive, not deductive. It's data-led, not only theory-led. Theories that are formed in the field with talking to real people or looking at real data, not in the library or not only in the library. And here it is. The aim is not to reduce complex systems into an observable variant like the aging process into an age in years variable. We want to take the complexity of the content into account. We want to try to understand that complexity, but in a more succinct way. All right, we're gonna move on. Okay, I've touched on this a little bit. Method for discovering new conceptual relations or patterns in qualitative data. That would be the grounded theory approach, which is we sample on the theoretical, we sample on the dependent variable. We sample on the thing that we want to know. And if we are interested in people's, voters, right, not just people's, but voters, because they're the ones who make the decisions, voters' evaluations of political leaders, well, then we're going to be sampling on the qualification of voting. Do you plan to vote in the next election? Or have you voted? Right, so if there are people like, I'm not interested in politics, I'm not going to vote, they're not going to be part of my sample. So people say, oh, well, your sample isn't representative because you don't have people who didn't vote. Like, well, yeah, that's in terms of generalizability in a quant's perspective, yes, but because what I'm interested in are the people who do vote, what goes on in their minds. Why would I talk to someone who doesn't fit in that category when I'm doing theoretical development? So theoretical sampling is the process of data collection for generating theory, whereby the analyst jointly collects, codes, and analyzes his or her or their data, and decides what data to collect next, where to find them, and in order to develop their theory as it emerges. And this process of data collection is controlled by the ideas that are coming out of the data. You don't know when you're going to reach theoretical saturation, because if you're looking at something for the first time, you don't know what the ends of the concept are. And you go back, ideally, you go back in the field until you reach theoretical sampling or theoretical saturation, where you're not finding any new ideas. And that's ideal, but of course that requires time and money, and not everyone has that. So because of this, what groups does one turn to in the next data collection? And you have to be able to justify your theoretical purpose for why you're choosing these people to talk to. Criteria for sampling must be based on theoretical considerations, not generalizable ones in a traditional quantitative setting. In quantitative research, the number of cases you have determines your margin of errors, but in qualitative research, we decide that we don't need to go back in the field when we've reached that theoretical saturation. It means that you know basically everything that is going to be said before you start, and you don't come across anything new in your data collection round. When it comes to formulating a research question, in quantitative research, you have a specific theory with a specific causal relationship, and you have prior work, presumably, that has a long established history of what happens. Like, is this theory good? Does it have a positive or a negative effect on the dependent variable? Is it a large effect? Is it a small effect? And you are very precise in your theoretical wording when it comes to your hypothesis and your null effect, because you know exactly what you're looking for. The qualitative side, the research question can change over time. And if you get theoretical tunnel vision, like you have a very inflexible notion of your concept, or you have some sort of research blindness or a blind spot because of your socio-demographic location. You're not thinking about other kinds of people who might be relevant to your question, but you haven't sampled from them yet because of some sort of, like perspective blindness. Then these are things that we want to encourage flexibility in the qualitative research perspective. We would want to make sure that we would be open to the full range of possible participants. Also, as we're developing this emerging category, concept, account, causal account, I don't want to call it an explanation, I'll call it a causal account of linking phenomenon together, then your aim here is to try to bring more precision and be data-led in that precision of where the boundaries of this concept are. If you have a very vague question like, what do people like about party leaders? Or, basically, if you have the less you understand the concept that you're looking for, or you're very vague in the concept that you're looking for, then when data comes out, you might not recognize it. So this part of it is just to say, do your background research, understand what's gone before you, understand the concepts. Don't use them as a prison, don't exclude things because they don't meet your criteria, but you have to know it deeply enough to know when you see something that's related. And that's you kind of know it when you see it. You need to ask how you're going to ask your questions, and will they influence the kinds of data you produce. As qualitative researchers, we know we're co-creators. But that doesn't mean that we should be leading. So what do I mean by that? All right. When a quantitative social scientist wants to have a really clean, test of a causal relationship, they can do experiments. Let's say it's an experiment on exposing people to just like disturbing images, not violent ones necessarily, but like spiders, things, an infected wound, things that can be unpleasant, right? Not necessarily like mentally harmful, but they are unpleasant to look at, and then measure their political reactions afterwards. What this test was designed to find is the idea that people who are more sensitive to negative affective information, like fear, being grossed out, being repulsed, being angry about things, if you are highly sensitive to that, you're more likely to vote conservative because you want to avoid those things. And conservatives tend to take, a more hardline position. Like, again, maybe not in this particular political dimension we live in, but generally, right? This is what neurological political science is finding. People with a higher tolerance for these images, like they have a reaction, but it's not as intense physiologically. Their hearts don't go quite up quite as much. Their blood pressure doesn't, their pupils don't dilate as much. Whatever, they have a more dulled reaction. They, yeah, Liz Truss dressed as Thatcher, precisely. That they're more tolerant. They're like literally more tolerant of things because they're not as emotionally impacted by the image that a conservative person is. And the link here is that, conservative people are protecting themselves, and so they tend to respond better to these, it is the more intense physiological response that underpins the social conservatism because people are protecting themselves. Yes, even spiders. PZ would be so mad, or so sad. All the spider bias. Agreed. All right. But in qual, we know that the researcher can't not be part of the data creation process because it is through the process of interacting with someone else that you co-create a situation to produce the data. So we're not holding ourselves to some metric of hermetically sealing off our participants from, our interaction with us and every single influence except for this one thing, right? Social scientists want the equivalent of a clean room for their experiments. And a qual person would say, well, that's just not the real world. I mean, it's helpful to try to isolate things in the lab, but in the real world, people aren't, they have a lot of things in mind, and a lot of things are connected, and their answers might depend on how they feel that day, and that's not a problem. That's how people are. Right? But how do you then make sure that you aren't influencing your participants, that you're not leading them? I think this is where we get into the qualitative side of where a researcher ends up having to, or should, kind of declare their role in it. So in a qualitative perspective, transparency and self-reflection about your role as a co-creator in this data process, and being open about that so that other people can read your work and understand whatever biases or perspectives or interests you have. If I declare I'm a feminist researcher and I'm going to be doing this research to look at how patriarchy oppresses various people, then someone else who comes to the data with, let's say, like a LGBTQIA plus perspective, they're going to have to read everything I am doing through a completely, my feminist blends might be somewhat relevant to them, but there are going to maybe be things in the data I miss because I'm not looking at it from their perspective, and they see something that I wouldn't because I'm not looking at LGBTQIA issues per se, but I'm looking at patriarchy within a broader framework. And therefore, so from a qual perspective, everyone has biases, or at least a perspective, a standpoint, somewhere they're sitting. No one is neutral and objective in qualitative research. We all have perspectives. And the point isn't to try to eliminate something that we can't eliminate, it's to be honest about it. Transparency is the reply. The other thing that's important to plan out when you're doing qualitative research, and oh my God, there's so much data we produce, is what kind of analysis do you want to do at the end of this? If you go around and you collect a bunch of data, and you've got transcripts, and you've got written data, and you've got some video data or clips or whatever else, and then you decide at the end, okay, now how am I going to analyze this data? You're screwed. You're really screwed. It's like going into it's like going into baking a really complicated cake, going out and buying all your ingredients and then checking the cupboards to see if you have the right baking pans and trays and a working oven. It's too late at that point. Like you really needed to figure out if you had the right pans before you started doing all your shopping, right? And that's kind of the same way with qual, is not if, or quants too. You need to know what your mode of analysis, your method of analysis of your data is going to be. And then when you design your research to collect the data, you need to make sure that every step of the process can be analyzed, right? And that's just good research design. And you will be asked, how are you going to analyze this data? So you have to think about it anyway. This just shows that this qualitative research is an iterative process, not a linear one. We don't get to an answer and then just write our papers. We are, looking at emerging concepts, categories, and conceptual or causal accounts throughout the process. Same thing. All right, and then when you get to your data, the array of categories or ways that you can analyze the same data can be overwhelming. So presumably, you have your question, and your question is going to be answering a question for one of these points, these units of analysis. So are you interested in what people mean when they say things? Are you interested in the practices people engage in and their behaviors and how they go about doing it? I don't know that here maybe my episodes or encounters, roles. You might want to look at what roles people possess in society, and how that impacts their perspective on things. You could be analyzing relationships, power relationships, familial relationships, and looking at potential causal relations there. There's also, what groups people are in, organizations, lifestyle. So when you're coding your data, having a clear understanding of what it is that you're looking for, like what do people mean, or how do people physically enact these things, and that's what you're collecting. Knowing that, even if you don't know what the codes are going to be, knowing what you're coding is really important. All right. Hi, Sean, by the way. Good to see you. Thank you for stopping by. These are questions by Laughlin and Laughlin to provoke qualitative researchers into thinking, okay, is this relevant to my question and my data? So is it a type? What type is it? Is it a structure? What is its structure? Are you looking at the frequency of a phenomenon? Well, how frequent is frequent? What do people attribute causality to? When people explain their behaviors, what things do they give as accounts to make their own behaviors make sense to themselves? Are there processes at work that you're investigating? And are those processes always visible? Systemic racism is rather oblique in terms of how it functions. If it was obvious and in your face, it would already be it's already illegal. It's already legally, you can be held legally liable for such blatant racism. So how do people practice within a process of hiring or a process of a workplace hostility to people or not? You might be looking at consequences, which is a higher bar, so you need to really think about cause and effect in those cases. And even if it's not the case that the cause and effect are there, people might think a cause and effect are there. So if you were interested in trying to understand how exactly people, Trump terrorists, think the election was stolen, then you might be interested in how many different competing narratives out there are there about why a particular state lost, or why a particular state, went for Biden. So is there a dead voter kind of thing going on? So anyway, the more you understand about what you want to ask, here's the takeaway. The more you think about what it is exactly you are investigating relative to what is coming up in the data. Like when this person says this thing, do they mean what this is? Should I follow this up? It's a constant ongoing process. And then I just go into my initial study design for my first to my 2010 qualitative election study. All right, so let's see. Okay, let's go over a little bit because I have done most of this already. But another thing I do want to mention is the importance of a research diary. I know during one of our elections we kind of vlogged it and talked about our experiences, and that was useful. But honestly, like I don't think we need to do it every time because it hasn't changed that much, and it's a lot of extra work, and we're already like overwhelmed with all the data processing. But in this case also the study is very well established, and so the value of asking these questions over and over again, I think is already well established, and like our mode of doing it is consistent from time to time. But for like a newly funded research project or a PhD, keeping a research diary on not only your like the process itself and the people you're meeting and notes on the theory, but also your own perspectives. How has your mind changed, or what have you learned since the start of this? Again, it's kind of like an ethnographic or autoethnographic, I think it is, form of research. Maybe no one will read it, but if there is an auditor or a peer review person who wants to evaluate your research on a higher level, it's available there, or you can submit it as part of your PhD to help you. So what goes into a qualitative research design? Summary of what happens each day you work on the project, stories of the conversations or discussions you've had with people, questions, notes on topics for further study or investigation, even your thoughts, your hunch, your guesses. And if you've had a dream about it, maybe work that out, diagrams, drawing, mind maps, reflections on what you saw, reflections on reading your diary, notes for the future. So it's just basically like making an effort to take some notes to track the process. Because articles in academia are usually 7,000 to 9,000 words, you don't have a lot of space for yourself as a researcher and to talk about your experiences, the research process, or in the research process. We go on a little side tangent here. Oftentimes when you read read an article, it starts off and they tell you what's going to happen. They tell you, a good abstract will tell you what the article concludes at the end of the day. And when you read through it, they have the right data and they do the right tests, and then they do the right other tests and they do other things, to make sure like, oh, I've checked this and power analysis or bootstrapping or whatever the methodological checks that they do. It all looks like they knew what they were doing from the beginning. It looks like when they set out to do this test, they mastered it. They had no doubts ever about what was going to come out or what methods they were going to do. And that's just not how it works. There is an illusion of knowledge, of perfection by the end of the research process or by the end of the article writing process, because your peer review people have made you do a bunch of things or rewrite a bunch of things so that it looks like you knew to do that from the beginning, unless they acknowledge, oh, thanks to reviewer 2 who suggested this analysis. And as a consequence, when you experience doing research, especially early on in your career, you don't experience that at all. You experience a lot of, like things that don't go your way or models that didn't work or whatever else. And if we were honest in how we experienced the production of knowledge, it would look a lot less certain and it would look a lot more tentative and exploratory and backtracking and just realistic. But by the end of it, you don't have the word space to really reflect on yourself as a researcher, your research process. You need to get to those results. And the research diary is a place to actually provide that documentation for future. So we're going to skip that. All right, that rest of that. All right, I was hoping to do a quants and a qual one today, but clearly not, because I've got here with y'all I went way too long my lecture notes. I always talk way more than I think I'm going to, which probably says something about me. Is there, let's see, view, is there a way to, I don't want the outline view. No, can I zoom this up? So what I'd like to do ideally is just have a screen. No, okay, that's dumb. That's not going to work. All right. reading view. No, that wasn't it. Ah, help, get me out. Okay, I guess we're just doing normal view. I hate normal view, but there's nothing else we can do about it. It's nothing for it today. I can't fix it. So what I would like to do is just show you how I would go about. It's fine. You have a nice voice and we have time. Oh, thank you, Flint. Appreciate that. We're just gonna make up a BS research design for qual data. Not BS in that it's not valid so much as like we're going to do it on a topic that I don't know that well, so I'm not saying that this could be a research design. I want to find something that is plausibly intuitive so you can understand the logic, which I'll get to in just a second. First, I need to warm up my... You know what? All right, if we're going to go a little long today, which we might end up doing, I want to warm up my coffee because it's gone cold and it's half a cup. So I'm going to flip us back to the pre-show music and video while I go stretch my legs, warm up my coffee, and then you can do the same. We'll come back not more than 5 minutes, and we will continue on with doing a spontaneous, we meant what you knew, yes, thank you. We're going to do this sort of like off-the-cuff qualitative research design. All right, sound good? Well, you don't have a choice, because I'm in charge. So I will turn the smooth jazz back up, and I will fade myself out. How you doing? Hope you're doing well. Yeah, okay, so now I've got now my coffee's too hot and it's too hot to drink. You never, like, the window of perfect coffee temperature is so short in life. It really is. Yeah, lava lamps. That's my default, like, waiting screen. Yeah. All right, let's get going on just a generic content analysis, like a research design. What would you do if you're just going, okay, I'm going to do some qualitative research. Let's say that, so qualitative research generally means you're going to be, thanks, welcome back to, that you're going to be looking at what people do, say, or think, usually more like saying, the saying part of it, because the thinking is also like you have to say what you think for people to know. But in this case, we're going to do a content analysis. So content analysis means you're going to look at some form of text. And content analysis is the most quantsy, potentially quantsy form of qualitative like research you can do. The overlap of it is the reason why content analysis is the quantiest of qual, or the qualiest of quants, ultimately comes down to the fact that it's grounded in text. However, it's grounded usually in text that you can look at frequencies of appearances of words, or you can look at patterns of how words appear together, or phrases appear together, or attitudes or emotional affect, like, dislike, whatever, link up together. And the way that you can see this, one example of this is oftentimes general election studies will ask, what's the most important problem facing our country today? And then people will rant. And the survey respondent, or the survey giver, will make some notes on what the participants said. Maybe it's inflation is so high, gas prices are coming down, but they're still too high, and I'm really anxious about, like, the housing market. And those are 3 different points. They're all like linked on economics, let's say. So to a qual person, they would be looking at the various economic pieces of information, or maybe people are linking the economy to immigration, or maybe they're talking about abortion rights and access, or whatever it is. They might have 3 or 4 ideas in that open-ended response. So they could go through that data and pull out economic positive, or economic negative, inflation negative, housing market negative, right? And try to get a sense of the emotions, the meanings, the states of mind behind those phrases, and then cluster them up. And, the actual words themselves, or the phrases, again, it's a paraphrase in this case, but you could kind of do a word cloud, or maybe you'd sort of link a bunch of phrases together and then code that to look at what kind of demographic is bringing up these particular terms. Prediction. People who identify as cis women are far more likely to bring up abortion rights and access than cis men. Not saying cis men don't care, or that all cis women, but if you want to look at a general population and predict, like, who is giving these responses, generally people impacted most. And I'm saying cis women is mostly because, like, the population distribution. You could do an entire group, a qual group, on just like people who are trans or non-binary, their responses. But anyway, I'm sorry, didn't mean to cough at you. All right, from a quant's point of view, you can't have 3 answers and an answer. And what they end up doing with these most important problem is open-ended and not a list to choose from. When it's open-ended, they will code the first response, and they will code it like a personal economic situation, or sociotropic, or general economic situation. And they'll go and homogenize all of these individual comments, and they'll eliminate usually anything after the first comment, because it gets too complicated to code. So you get the most important problem that people responded with first, and all of their attitudes and whatever are homogenized into one single category, so that you can limit it to maybe 13 categories total across your sample set. And then you can run a frequency to see, are people mostly saying economic things, or personal economic situations, or the national economic situation, yada, yada, yada. So in this way, qual and quants, when it comes to content analysis, they use a lot of the same tools. They're just coming at it from different perspectives. And it's usually like I find a kind of easy way to see the qualitative, quantitative divide isn't always such a divide. But let's say we were interested in analyzing, I'll take some notes here. Yeah, on this one. So we want to know about media, language. I'm just going to make this up around high gas price and price, because media, yeah, or language, media language use. Okay. So my idea here is when it comes to, so high gas prices are basically an annual political event. Usually sometime between June and August in the US, gas prices will go up substantially, even outside of like the Ukraine stuff. Summer high gas prices is like almost every year or every other year, you're going to get a few weeks where everyone's just complaining about gas prices. And let's just speculate that I'm interested in the kinds of language used in the media, terms, tone, and whatnot, right, to characterize high gas prices as a challenge for whatever president is in office, right? So that's one level of it. So what is the nature of language used to, and I'm going to like maybe limit it here to like headlines, right? To headlines, linking high gas prices and the president, for like, even if that's in all like positive, negative, and neutral. So what I'm saying here is that high gas prices don't have to be like, it's about blaming so-and-so. You know, maybe it's Russian invasion and high gas prices, and it's providing a different account. Again, I'm kind of just making this up, right? But the idea here is that I have a general question here. How do I get at this qualitatively? So that should cover it. So we want to know what kind of language is being used. The next question is what time period, because that the longer the time period, the more data we have. More data we have, the more data we have to process. And so, but I also don't want to just have a sample of like Biden or Biden versus Trump. We want to look to see if there are wider patterns across time. So let's say I would want to go back to, given that the internet really got going in the 90s, and I don't really know what's on LexisNexis. Hey, Gift, good to see you. Then I want to make sure that the data is available. I don't want to have to go back to newspaper copies in the 1970s or depend on a very highly selective set of newspapers that have been made digitized, you know, like the New York Times versus other papers. Local papers probably wouldn't have that. So let me I could probably go back to the Clinton administration. Maybe in this initial foray, we want to go back, Clinton, who was before Clinton? Yeah, I think Clinton would be about the time the dot-com bubble and all that was starting to go up. All right. Why do people even assume the president can set gas prices? Yeah, I know, that's another whole thing. And it's the over-attribution of power to whoever is the leader. We have a whole conversation about presidential or leader evaluations and economic, you know, like responsibility. So I need enough of a sample. I'm lazy. I don't want to go offline. I want everything online. So we'll say Clinton to president for our time period. And then, so this is going to give us our longitudinal scope, like how long are we going to look at this? And the reason I want Clinton, who was after Clinton? Was it Bush? Yeah, George Bush. So you get a Democrat, you get a Republican, then after Bush it's Obama, but you get 8 years of Bush, so you get a bunch of samples on a Republican president. You get Obama for 8 years, and you get Trump for 8 years, or sorry, they got for 4 years. And so it means that I'm getting Democrats and Republicans, I'm getting a good mix in this time period. and I'm getting enough, period, like long enough period of time where I'm not just talking about what happened, in the last 50 years. So that would be a reasonable time period to start with. And then we can talk about sampling later, because there might be a lot of headlines, so we might have to do a subsample of our sample to just get a sense of what's in the data first, but all right. And in terms of sources, right, there are a lot of potential articles, a lot of potential, what counts as media? Right, this is another question you'd have to ask if you want to do this research. So I've been thinking about this in terms of headlines and newspaper headlines, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, there are videos now with headlines that, like segments on YouTube. So if it were possible to get a downloaded list by media provider like the CNN website or the MSNBC website, I don't know if this data exists, but let's say it does, that allows you to look at the video clip headlines for various media outlets. That in theory could be a data source to look at. But let's keep it old school. Let's talk about newspaper headlines and news article headlines. But what counts as news? Are we going to look only at daily papers? Are we going to look at things like The Economist? Are we going to look at papers like Foreign Affairs? When we talk about headlines, are we going to talk about editorial headlines? Or are we going to only look at things in the business section? So there aren't right answers to these questions. And that is another thing I kind of want you to get about like qual and exploratory research. It's not that there are right or wrong answers to how to do the research. It's the implications for the data you're going to produce at the other side. So if we only, let's say we limit it to daily papers with a national distribution, or let's say, actually, no, I'm going to change it. Sorry, I'm going to change this entirely because I want to do a comparison. We're going to do media headlines. We're going to do television headlines. Let's say we could get this magical data set of YouTube's titles, where we could mass download all of the titles used for a channel. I don't think that exists, but let's say it does. And we've got videos now going back as far as they can go, maybe to Clinton, I don't think so. But as long as they've had videos up on YouTube, we would take that stuff and go forward in time from their earliest video to their current period. Then I have to think, okay, well, what channels are we going to use? So given that we're, let's just say, we know that there's highly politicized framing of the news in the United States, and we want to capture the variation in that polarization. What I would say is we should take we should download, there we go, video titles from Fox. I'm not going to put news because they're not news. And this will be because of the empirical grounding of them as being a right-wing news outlet. And then we'll take MSNBC for the perspective on the left. And then theoretically, we could, I think, justify taking NPR, National Public Radio, or whatever else, but yeah. What is oh, PBS, that's what the television version is called, PBS. Because PBS is reported to be the most trusted news source in America. People on the left trust, people on the left are more likely to trust MSNBC than any other group. People on the right are more likely to trust Fox than any other group. But if you look at Americans as a group, generally, then PBS is considered a neutral one. So this would allow us to account for the framing. CNN, yeah. I'm kind of taking the extremes here, DN fan, but yeah, you could, CNN could maybe be seen as more of a medium situation between Fox and MSNBC, but I'm going with PBS based on my knowledge, personal knowledge, that when it comes to media trustworthiness, PBS is still viewed as the most trustworthy, not trustworthy, let's say neutral, or unbiased, or actually it might be trustworthy too. Let's just, hey, you know what? We don't have to guess. Why don't we look most trusted media U.S. U.S. news industry, trust in media, where Americans get their news in 2022. So if I were actually going to do this as a theory, I would use this kind of data to justify my theoretical framing for why I'm sampling from different groups. Americans' views, Weather Channel and PBS is the most trustworthy. So in my theoretical section, I would count this as like why I am picking this particular category for framing. The idea here is that right-wing media will frame it in a right-wing way. Left-wing media should, if prediction goes correctly, frame it in a left-wing way. And PBS isn't neutral, right? That's not, I'm not giving the category of objective or without bias or without any kind of perspective. What I will say, though, is that the framing given by PBS is the most likely to be cited as trustworthy. That's different from saying that it's neutral or it's true or whatever. We're talking about people's perceptions of these media framings, not the truth of what is behind it. All right, ONN because they haven't, so why wouldn't I pick OAN? Because they haven't been around long enough to fit within my time period. I think OAN has only been around for a couple of years and therefore it would really skew the comparison, whereas Fox has been around for like, what, 20, 30 years now as a news outlet, so, Alrighty-dighty. Okay, and so from this, I would have a theoretical accounting here. So the goal is to be able to capture media framing by having three categories of data sources. Capture media framing by trusted by right viewers, left. So we're taking the most trusted by each political group and then general Americans, right? Left viewers and then general public. Everyone together. Right, so at this point I have enough to get going for my data collection at this point, right? I know my interest is the language used in media headlines for the specific mentioning of high gas prices and whoever is the president at the time. I have a general time period for when I will be collecting those data. Now, Fox probably existed before MSNBC, so and PBS, of course, existed long before Fox. So it would be a matter of, I'm not trying to get a perfect comparison in terms of, you know, if I don't have data for MSNBC, I can't look at the Fox data or I can't look at the PBS data because I'm looking at how a media outlet presents it over time. The time period is, the language that they use is more important than having, oh, this is what they said about Clinton, this is what they said about Biden. I might just have, if I establish a pattern, let's say Fox is a pattern of being more critical of Democratic presidents on gas prices than Republican ones. I don't need to artificially start at Obama and only compare Obama and Trump. I can establish that pattern because I'm looking for key concepts, categories, and causal accounts, right? Qualitatively, I don't have to be a one-to-one comparison on that. And then same thing, you know, like for MSNBC, I would predict that they would have more favorable headlines to a Democrat, although, you know, Democrats tend to complain about other Democrats more than Republicans do, even though they do complain a lot, Republicans, but they tend to be more loyalists, as we found, more responsive to authoritarian structures and more deferential to hierarchy. Anyway, keeping more fascist. Anyway, so I would expect to collect data that give insights to the left account, and then the question on NPR isn't what is the neutral account or what is the middle account. It is how does NPR frame their headlines to be perceived as trustworthy? And is that framing substantially different or noticeably or traceably different? Like you can actually like demonstrate empirically in the data that PBS tends to frame its headlines in ways that are in this way distinguishable from Fox and in this way distinguishable from MSNBC. so you've got the beginnings there, and at the point you would want to go out and you'd want to look to see, like, you know, collect your data. And we don't necessarily want to talk about like statistical packages or modes or stuff, but you would want at that point to well, you want to start with your data. Yeah, like identify your data source. I would also at this point do a pilot study. Now the purpose of a pilot study. Pilot study. It's as practical as it sounds. You might be wrong. Like your entire idea here, I might just, you know, I might end up finding, I don't think I would, but I might end up finding if I investigated this, that the language used is almost identical when gas prices are high regardless of media outlet. It might be the case. I don't think it is, but let's say it is the case. If I start my data collection by going through and downloading all of the Fox News headlines without reference to PBS or MSNBC, and I just start open coding all of the Fox data, I'm going to waste my time because there's no there there. Like, I think there's a there there, but let's say for the purposes of this, there's no there there. There being no there there, you're not going to find that out if you start doing the study from the beginning. So you run a little pilot study. Let's say you're going to take the richest data, the most recent data. So you're going to take Trump and Biden data. You're going to download news headlines from all three media outlets around high gas prices for Biden and, you know, the last year for Trump when gas prices went high, the last time that they were high. And then you would code the Trump and the Biden framing and language usage. Sorry, a quick cough. And look to see if there's a difference. You just eyeball it, because if you do 40 cases for 40 different headlines and you're not finding any noticeable difference, and you're like, I'll go a little bit further, I'll compare 100 headlines and look for it. You don't find it, it'll just stop. Like, either you need to rethink something in your research design, because you're not finding any of the things that you thought you should find based on the literature and maybe your own intuition, or there's something wrong with your research collection that's a problem. Maybe you need to take the first 4 paragraphs of text and hand code those to get a better insight. So the pilot is just to take it out for a test drive, see how it works, see the data it produces, look for and anticipate any problems or other things that you might have missed or things that you don't need to do. Maybe you can be more efficient in your data collection. So that would be like the next stage, I would say, is pilot the study and do preliminary analysis. And then you can also, at this point, reassess efficacy of your study. And then go out in the field and do your stuff. So now, from a qualitative perspective, analysis of the data. When it comes to analyzing the data, so now you're going to have this big dump of data. So we know that we want to organize it. One of the factors that we know will have an influence is the person in the White House. We know that the framing of the media outlet will be reflected. We also know, for instance, that we're going to have more observations for a person who's in office longer. I can't spell observations for 2-termers. Than 1, but this really, like, so this means we can't use can't use simple frequency as a metric, as a valid metric. that just means because people talk about Barack Obama, there are more observations of media headlines around gas prices and Barack Obama. Doesn't mean that like Democrats get talked about more. You want to see, we don't want a spurious correlation here. We don't want to try to equate two things that don't really exist. So what we will need to do is maybe give an overall score for each president in each media category. So for, let's say, George W. Bush, we would have Fox high gas price coverage, PBS half gas price coverage, and MSNBC. And we might be looking at popular words and phrases used by Fox News, NPR, and MSNBC, but we're going to count the categories. We're not going to count the frequency of headlines. All right? Hi, Lee. Good to, I missed you too. Thank you for coming back. So we can't use simple frequency as a valid source for drawing conclusions. Let me give you an example where you could use a simple frequency. Let's say there's a phrase that comes up in an election at a certain point, or an issue that comes up at a certain point. Say there's a like immigration crisis or something in the middle of an election. You can look to see the number of times a word like immigration shows up before this crisis point, and see when people spontaneously bring it up if it's not in your interview schedule, and then notice this event, and then look to see if the immigration issue or whatever it is, or abortion rights issue, is mentioned more frequently spontaneously afterwards. So you could see that you would be able to demonstrate empirically before, let's say, Roe v. Wade overturned, abortion rights and access barely ever was mentioned as a spontaneous issue in a focus group. This is just all speculation. I'm not saying what's true, right? I'm just hypothesizing for the purposes of illustrating the point. Then the Roe v. Wade decision comes out, and after that point, you're noticing people are spontaneously mentioning abortion rights. Then you could compare the before and after. And the simple existence of the frequency, the increased frequency, is itself causally related to the event, right? But in our analysis, a two-term shouldn't count more than a one-term for the purposes of analyzing language. So we want to control for that, as it were. So another thing we would want to establish is some sort of way, some sort of be transparent in our method of coding a headline or a term or a phrase as positive, negative, or neutral, or what. Now here, what I would say is, we have too many headlines to not do some higher order level of discussion. If we were doing, a focus group of 8 people who all really are picky about what washing up liquid they use, and they're willing to, really go in and they're experts in dishwashing liquid, getting value for money, right? I would be more interested in the exact words they use and preserving their phrases perfectly, because that might have an influence on the product development. But when I have so many words to deal with, I can't handle that amount on an individual level. I need a conceptual overhang. I need some category to put things in, and then we can go under the hood and look what makes up this category. So we probably want some kind of metric of deciding, like, when gas prices are discussed and the president is, looks good or whatever else. It would be super hard. Gas prices are very difficult. Most people just, the only time you get coverage is when they're going up and people are mad. And so we would need to acknowledge that skew probably exists in our headlines too. So you might see something like a positive headline might be 30 days of gas prices fall 30 days in a row under Biden. Right? So the general thing here is that reduced prices equals better for people, and we're going to make that inferential leap of logic to say that that headline is good for Biden. Now, someone could disagree with that, and they could say, actually, that's neutral. That's fine. Like, you can go ahead and recode the data, do your own analysis. For the purposes, we need some kind of metric, and this was the metric we're doing. So we need a criteria for coding our data as positive, negative, neutral, or maybe some sort of mixed like it's partly positive and partly neutral, we might come across things in the data that just don't neatly fit into a category, and therefore need to be open to alternative categories, alternative new categories. Maybe we're gonna find ones that come up about gas prices that link, let's say, Biden and green energy, which you know, like is more complicated than just a simple positive negative. Maybe there's, you know, the environmental angle, like high prices linked to need for green energy, says Biden. Whatever, like we're not really doing this, so it doesn't really matter. But you know, these are the kinds of questions you need to think in advance and to keep a theoretical flexibility. And so you get your you get your data. We have that. We have some coding. So then we would need to, if we had a second person, we want to do, in this case, we want to do next week open coding. Open coding, and we're getting into analytics and grounded theory, but basically it is a data-led development of categories, concepts, and causal accounts. So I don't want to use explanation. I'm going to end up using this in my article we're publishing, I think. Because I'm not going to use the word explanation. We know from our positivist thing about the word of explanation and how much meaning it carries for quantitative people. So we need to be careful in our language. And causal accounts. And this is going to allow, it's organically data-led development. Like, no exclusion at this point. Possible categories. And let's say that we have green energy that starts to emerge now, you know, in the last 20 years in these headlines. And these are new things. I would say at the open coding stage, the very first time you start reading through the data and trying to figure out what are there patterns here that we should be noticing. This is the most wide open, enriched area. You could find, you know, like the most niche category that ever existed at this point. You know, like for instance, there's a whole thing about gas prices that are linking to electric cars and comparing, you know, like just that's something that ends up coming up a lot. Gas prices relative to like the purchase of electric cars and how much would it cost to run an electric car or a petrol-driven car, comparison articles, whatever, start really emerging. Don't exclude that code at this point because it doesn't fit in your positive, negative, or neutral. This is the whole don't have blinders. Whatever you see that clusters, if it's, you know, two or more are gathered, give it a name. That's a little play on Jesus. But if you have two or more ideas that link together across time, across medium, or media, I should say, put it together, just stick it together, and maybe you'll find it's a dimension of something else. So maybe what we're going to end up doing by the end of this is that anytime green energy is mentioned, or electric cars are mentioned, or fossil fuels being linked to greenhouse gases and high prices, whatever, we're going to give that like an environmental code. And what we might find is that there's an entire environmental angle that occasionally comes up. Maybe it's more on PBS, maybe it's more on MSNBC, right? Or maybe it is even mentioned negatively on Fox. But whatever it is, it wasn't on our radar right away. We were just thinking presidents, prices, supply up and down. But the data have led us, and again, I'm making all of this up. I don't know what's out there, so please don't quote me on this. The data are saying in our fictional account that the media are linking climate change or fossil fuel availability or decline or transitioning to green energies. They're inserting that into the narrative. And they're probably doing that in response to things in society because people are interested in it, yada, yada, yada. But the fact is, just because we can't easily code these green or fossil fuel or electric car comparison headlines into a positive, negative, neutral category doesn't mean we should shut them out. This is where the whole induction and the new development. And the whole research perspective might change. It might be the rise of linking gas prices to green energy over since Clinton. Like, so we could end up, again, I'm making all of this up, but we could end up by the end discovering the rate at which green concerns are linked to gas prices. Maybe we'll find that those green energy concerns and gas prices are linked more in the summer months in the States where things are on fire, or in Western Europe, or in the Northern Hemisphere, right? So then that is why the open coding and being completely atheoretical is important. And because then you can identify these emerging trends or these emerging categories and give them form, give them shape, give them a criteria, and then you're making an original contribution. Then from a quant's point of view, let's say it's a case. Let's say that we've done this analysis, and in our made-up research, we end up finding the key. We get really distracted by this whole green energy thing, which is fine. This is the thing, like if you're doing qualitative research and you go and looking at one thing and you end up finding a whole new piece of thing to research, follow it, go ahead. It's not like I'm generating a hypothesis and then changing my hypothesis halfway through my research. You can't do that in quants. Well, you could, but you have to go back to the beginning and start all over again, right? But in qual, you can just like go down a rabbit hole. Just go, see what you can find. So our made-up research findings here are that there is a noticeable increase in linking green, we call them green topics. By that we mean electric cars or fossil fuels or emissions or whatever else, but green topics to gas prices, after 2001. Again, I'm totally making this up. So that's new. Like that, let's say that's completely new finding, and someone publishes this, and they go, another researcher reads it, and like, oh, I really want to test this idea. It's interesting, but I don't really know if it's going to pan out across all media. Maybe this is just, Fox, dissing on the Green New Deal for 2 years, or, maybe this is just an NPR, ESG, I know that they would do ESG, but like an MSNBC thing or whatever. So a quants person could say, I want to go into the world and test this. And they would probably, what they would then do is get a much wider data set sample, right? Because ours was exploratory, so we only needed a smaller sample. We weren't trying to generalize our findings to all media. We were trying to analytically establish this category that as, the speculation is as worry about climate change increases, so too does the linkage between gas or gas prices, something to do with the cost of gas, and concerns about green energy or ideas about green energy in media framing. And they could say, all right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and, if that's okay, and if this is a case, if these analytical categories are sticky, if they are substantive, if they reemerge, then at this point, the category should also appear in newspaper articles, right, in other forms. This shouldn't just be a Fox News, MSNBC, PBS thing if these are true analytic categories. And a quants person who doesn't want to deal with YouTube titles because they're too complicated or whatever, they're going to go use LexisNexis. They're going to download a much wider sample from the same time period, but they would sample from Fox and The Economist, Wall Street Journal. They would also maybe, look internationally at like The Guardian, or, who knows what their framing could be, right? But let's just keep it in America. So they would, let's say, also get like Mother Jones, right? And they do a whole, again, they try to replicate the spectrum of media perspectives and what people's perceptions of trustworthiness are. They would get way more samples. Then they would have to go through and kind of replicate our coding. They might have to establish, because they're using a slightly different form of media, right? It's not clickbait titles on YouTube, but it's clickbait titles on the internet from newspapers, and code and start to look for the same kinds of relationships. And if they could code mentions of gas prices and energy and energy being defined as a mention of emissions or wind or electric cars, so they would have to specify what constitutes green in their category. Then they could create a green category. They could create a category for mentioning gas prices. They could create a category for filtering out what presidency it was, and they could also have a category for whether or not the overall spin was positive, positive, neutral, 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 negative, and whatever metrics they wanted to come up with, right? And then you could multiply that by this, so anyway, they could go ahead and do their analysis on test our theory on a much larger scale with way more samples and points, and they could test whether or not the frequency of mentions between green energy and gas prices have gone up over time, controlling for who is in the presidency, the framing of the media, and, whatever type of media it is, whether it's like The Economist, or whatever, it's quants. As long as your model isn't over-specified, you could do whatever you want. And this is how, like, the quants qual look at very similar data, but from their own perspectives. And I think it's the easiest way to understand how a qualitative researcher would think about a question and how a quantitative researcher could think about a question using basically the same data, or getting near the same data sources and the same theoretical framing and the same kind of theoretical or research question on the same topic. But they establish completely different things. Right? The qual establishes the analytic categories, what would I say? Codes, categories, concepts, and causal accounts. And the quants is doing their thing. They're testing it. Like, is this a thing that we only find in YouTube headlines? Which could be the case, right? So that's why we need to go out in the world and test things after we come up with some ideas about a causal relationship. Or is this something that is a general media phenomenon? A raising of consciousness of green issues when we talk about high gas prices. So if that was our research question, that's a way we could do an entire PhD, for instance. Now, I'm sure this has already been investigated, so I don't think it's original, but you could go from an exploratory, inductive, data-led, grounded theory informed categories, concepts, and causal accounts of media framing, and then you could turn around and make it into a deductive theory predicting relationships that you should see in other forms of media if these analytic categories hold across time and forms of media. And then once you've established that qualitatively and quantitatively, then you've got a new finding. Like, you can publish that and you're going to be famous, right? So not famous, I mean academic famous. Academic famous, I think, is like getting cited. Like, I don't know if there's a minimum threshold for getting cited in academia, but that's how you become but that's my version of immortality, is the fact that I'm forever on a few pieces of information making contributions to human knowledge. So I've got no DNA to offer the world. I am not a breeder, and therefore that's my contribution. Yeah, so that's it. That's me taking you for a little tour of research design, and how qual can be quantsy and how quants can be a bit quali, but still stay in their lanes and be interactive and complement each other. So yeah, I was very over optimistic in how many slides I would need, so that's not such a big deal. I can recreate this at any time. Hey, all right, so I've gone for an hour and a half, which seems to be fair considering I was gone for 3 weeks. But that's going to be the show for this week. I guess it would probably be a good idea if I gave you a preview of what's going to happen next week. I honestly am not entirely sure what I want to talk about next week. I'm not sure if I want to kind of like go more into research design, and so we've done ethics, see a case study, comparative methods. I don't really, I'll have to have a look, because a lot of this is on data collection methods and then data analysis and reliability, validity, generalizability, which we've already discussed a bit, and how to write up your research. I need to think. I need to think of what I want to do. So if you want to find out if you want to solve the mystery, show up again next Sunday. And now I am going to start wrapping this up, because I have a D&D game to prep for tonight, and I want to chill out chillax before before Monday. And I have to go back to work. Thank you so much for stopping by. Thank you so much for returning after a 3-week break. It had crossed my mind that I might get a bunch of drop-offs of people who won't want to come back, but y'all came back, and I do appreciate that. Yeah, so if you want to see me again, you can always check me out at the Happy Hour on Twitch TV over on Kevin Logan's channel. I am on Twitter, usually yelling at people, or criticizing people who are bigoted and right-wing. You can always go over there and drop me a line, and if all of that is too much work, well, then just come back next Sunday and figure out a new topic for you to listen to and for me to talk about. But until then, I've been Kristi. Y'all have been awesome. Wow, I'm out of the habit. I need to queue up my YouTube screen to get my live stream button. Ah, there we go. So I can turn off the stream. All right, y'all. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Be safe, be happy, be well, wherever it is and whenever it is you are. Until next Sunday. See you later. Bye.